Looking today at the Voyage of TPRM maturity journey. And it's important to look at this in context. We're going to be focusing on one of the key areas that most organisations have difficulty with, which is transitioning from compliance mindsets to risk mindsets. But it's important to look at that in context. So here we have our 8 stages, and what we do is we move around this. So it starts off on stage 0. And stage 0 is really starting from nothing. It's important to just keep in mind that everyone needs to start from something, and programs will come as a reactionary event following something within the business changing and the need arising. It then moves to stage 1, which is really getting set up. And getting set up is an important piece, because what you're doing here is you're reacting. It's probably very informal. You're probably setting up processes and programs that are not the ideal, they're not the end state. As you move through to stage 2 in this crawling state, you're now starting to centralize some things. Maybe you're starting to organize, involve others into that process. Now, stage 3 is walking. And really, this is where you have a centralized program. You have something that's set up ready for everyone else to use. Now, in stage 3, in this walking stage, you end up in a state where if you were just after a compliance goal, this is perfectly fine. This is an area that a lot of organisations will be happy. You've achieved a tick box level of compliance, and it's fine. You can kind of stop your journey there. But for most organisations, and particularly those who attend the ISF events, you'll probably want to take this further. So this is where you start to move into stage 4, or jogging, where you really move from a compliance mindset into a risk mindset. And that's what we're going to focus on for the remainder of the presentation. But again, for context, the remainder of this journey is really into stage 5, which is running. And what this does is it takes all the hard work you've done in stage 4 and starts to look to the optimizations within it. It starts to look to build upon that with automation and robotics to make sure that you have a program that's self-sustaining, that's consistent, that reruns and repeats itself. Stage 6, you start to get into sprinting, and this is where we start to look at holistic GRC. This is where we start to look at bringing things together from the outside world, bringing in compliance programs, bringing in risk programs, bringing in audit programs into your TPRM journey. Now, a lot of people will want to rush into stage 5 and 6, and they want to really sprint into those areas, but you have to get into that walking to jogging mindset. It is a journey that you move through, and you have to move through those in order. Now, in our maturity model at SureCloud, we've also added flying. And this is the kind of blue sky, the blue ocean mentality around things. This is things like artificial intelligence, things like vendor assessments or shared vendor assessments, shared question content. All these things are great. They're wonderful. Blue sky, again, kind of nirvana state. But you have to move through this as a journey. You have to move through each of the stages and build up to that. And there are plenty of vendors who will start to tell you that you can fly from that walking stage, and it's just simply not true. So let's take a look at our stage 4 journey. So this is moving from a compliance mindset into a risk mindset. So stage 3 to stage 4. Now at SureCloud, we're using a company called Bananas as a story device to help us kind of work through this journey together. Now, the management team at Bananas have a strong focus on compliance, and historically have always done so. But recently they've had a change in leadership, and they've decided to look more into that risk mindset, to look more at what they can do outside of just a tick box compliance. And this is probably driven by media, news events, competition, all sorts of things. So what they've looked to do is set up a function, and the CISO's been asked to find someone within the business who can take on this TPRM function properly. So meet Sue. Now, Sue is previously working under the CISO, perhaps in a compliance role related to IT vendors. But given her background and experience, Bananas have chosen to move her into the forefront and looking at this properly. Her previous assessment experience has been around the cybersecurity framework, perhaps using some framework documents, achieving a level of compliance, combining that with maybe some privacy assessments following things like GDPR and other regulations. So she has a few assessments up her sleeve, and she's starting to roll that out to the business and starting to roll that out to vendors. She's achieving about 20% compliance at the moment, or a 20% testing cycle on those vendors. And really, again, managing to maintain that, but recognises that's not the full list, it's not the full business. She knows she doesn't have that full coverage, and that's one of the problems at Bananas. She needs to work out how she gets to that 100% coverage. It's important to think about this, that it's not about achieving 100% testing, but it's knowing about all of the vendors in your list and making sure that you've made an assessment on them. Originally, many companies were looking at services and looking at the services that were on offer. And because of Sue's background in IT, she's looked mainly at the key vendors around the IT space. But as you roll this program out further, you start to recognize other vendors within the business who are involved in not just an IT capacity. Now, there's been a lot of recommendations made by Sue over the years, and actually tracking those recommendations, both with the third parties and internal parties, has become quite tricky in knowing what's there, what still needs to be done, what still needs to be actioned. Now, Sue knows that she's not going to be able to test the full set of this list, so she needs to work out a way to differentiate between the people on this list. She needs to work out how to differentiate the vendors and how to treat them with the level of risk that they present to the organisation. So let's look at each of these in turn. Now, compliance and coverage is an important one to start with. We need to state and make it really clear that 100% coverage is not the goal. What we want to do is we want to know 100% of the vendors that you're working with, but it's not about testing all of those 100 vendors. It's about coming up with a suitable level of inspection on each of the vendors. Now, as an organisation grows, they don't intend to create stacks of policy documentation, processes and all these complex organisational assets, but they need to develop them over time because the complexity of the vendor risk picture really gets that complex and needs those additional assets brought in. What she also needs to do to ensure coverage is make sure that when new vendors come on board, they're added to the list. So she links in with those procurement processes to carry them through. Finally, there's a legacy piece. There's organisations that are being worked with today that are perhaps part of legacy arrangements or have been done by previous leaders within the business who've now moved on. And that sort of legacy that lasts around a while needs to be looked at. It needs to be assessed in terms of the risk picture it presents to the organisation. Now, if we start off looking at Sue's picture here, she's testing around 13% of the organisations within her list. We're going to pick 300 here as an example. So she's testing around 13%. She knows about a further 16% and has made an active choice that she's not going to test that extra 16%. There is probably about 70% that are unknown to Sue at this point, and she needs to come up with a method to do not only discovery around who those vendors are, but also look at what information she needs to capture to make an assessment. Now, there's various different areas of the business she can look to this. Things like legal often get forgotten about. They'll work with supporting agencies and supporting law firms that will provide advice. There will be customer support using all sorts of tools and transferring information in and out that presents privacy problems. There will be facilities allowing access to buildings and people coming and going. Marketing often use agencies and third-party freelancers, so it's worth keeping in mind that they may be working with extra third parties that the organisation isn't aware of. Sourcing may use distribution vendors and partners to figure out the sourcing arrangements. Logistics will be moving things from place to place and again could be forgotten in this chain of the third party. Research and development, again, another area of the business that's very dynamic, very agile, may not be looking at what they're testing, and so on and so forth. There's a list of these that she can go all around the business and have a look at, and it's really uncovering those stones and having a look underneath to see what there is. Sue's going to need to make sure she gets them on the way in. She's going to need to have a good relationship with procurement, and already does, but she needs to go further with that and needs to actually bake into their process, into their workflow, what she needs them to look at. Now, before moving into stage 4, we need to get something more robust. We need to think about this and actually put those processes in place. Sue's also aware of some parts of the organisation that don't follow the procurement processes. It's quite often to find that occasionally, particularly around sales teams and those sorts of folks, they'll pay for things on credit card and expense them back, so they don't enter into the procurement cycle. So it's really important that Sue knows this and actually starts to build some processes that take account of those exceptions. One of the things Sue needs to depend on as well is tone from the top. So as she goes through this, she is going to encounter resistance and she needs that support from key stakeholders in the business. Now, as Sue starts to look and discover all of these vendors, one of the really important things is to maintain accountability. Now, within governance, risk and compliance more generally, we understand the 3 lines of defence. And the 3 lines of defence are The first line being the business owners, the people within the business who own the risk and control. The second line, who are looking and providing oversight, some specialist functions like risk and compliance or third-party risk. And then third line is going to be an audit and assurance function. Sue's very much in that second line role, and if she's not careful when she starts to roll this out to the business, they very quickly want her to take the responsibility and ownership for those vendors. And she needs to make sure she sets very early on the expectations of who continues to own those relationships. And it has to stay with the first line with Sue providing oversight. This is one of the tricky areas that we find in a lot of organizations where we start to see this hybrid 1.5 line appear, where Sue is starting to carry out some of those organizational activities that should remain with the first line. So Sue now knows about coverage. She's now got a plan to find out what she doesn't know, but she now needs to think about differentiation. How is she going to figure out what she needs to test and who she needs to test? The first piece of that is going to be looking at scope. Now, the scope of the organisation can be quite broad. The scope of third-party reviews within the organisation can be quite broad. So here you can see a list of the various areas that you could be looking at from a third-party perspective. Financial stability and credit, commonly managed by a finance function or procurement functions. Strategic alignment, make sure that the organisation's goals are aligned with that of their partners. The reputational issues, there could be exposures if there are particularly unsavoury organisations that you're working with, or those who don't have sustainability credentials, or perhaps have different political viewpoints. All of this has to be factored in. The country of origin feeds into the later point around anti-bribery and corruption, and then quality also. Does the organisation have the ability to sustain quality? Do they have certifications like ISO 9000? Then at the bottom line here, we've got things that are specific to the engagement. So are we looking at cyber and information risk? And in most cases, that's where third-party risk starts from. Are there compliance and legal issues around contracts? Are there operational or resiliency issues that need to be dealt with? Now, Sue's going to focus her attention on the cyber information, compliance, legal, and resiliency risk. Sue's got her list of 300 vendors, and she needs to figure out how much she needs to test. Now, there's a bottom-up and a top-down way of doing this. Top-down, you can take the resources you have available and you can divide them amongst the activities you want to achieve. So things like an internal review of the available information could just be a very cursory view for your low-risk vendors. Your medium-risk vendors, you could be looking at taking a questionnaire type approach, and for those higher risks, you might want to do some additional level of inspection, maybe even on-site audits. So by working out how much those activities cost you in terms of effort, you can divide up the available time you have. Here you can see that Sue is looking to do 5% of these high-risk vendors, where she's looking to do some kind of on-site or certainly interview-style auditing. There's a portion of about 35% that she wants to do assessment-based testing. So she wants to send an assessment to them and receive some feedback. And about 60% that will remain not on her radar. That she'll do some kind of introspection, looking at the available data maybe that they've got on their compliance portal, online, and making a decision as to whether they need any further inspection. Now, if we look at the available time Sue has, she's the only person in the team. So if we take her time and really divide it amongst the available time here, she's going to be pushing things in terms of the ability to service this on her own. So Sue will need to start looking at and asking for more resources in this, but she can very easily calculate how much time she has available and what she can achieve with what she can do. One way of starting to get that resource conversation going is through service scoring. So Sue needs to show something to the board. She needs to show both a score in which what the achievement, but also she needs to set that within a context. And that's what a score can do for you. So here you can see it's a very simple A to F score that we presented, but this could be 1 to 5, it could be verbs, it could be anything. But effectively, this will give a board an opinion of, within a set scale, how is someone achieving and how well are they achieving it. So what Sue can do here is say that if she's achieving a 95% testing and review, then she's in that A category. 90% of high have been covered, but 70% of the medium, she's in that B, so on and so forth down this chain. This is going to allow her to, if she's not achieving a level of coverage, to go back to the board and say, I'm only achieving a C level of coverage, but I need more resource. So can I have that more resource? And I'll push for this service level to improve. This is something that sounds so straightforward and so obvious, but a lot of organisations forget and have the curse of knowledge, where you understand and know the domain in which you work, but the board doesn't, and they don't have interest in knowing about it. So you need to create a measure, a score, for which the board can understand and then reflect back on. Someone who's implemented many systems in the past will always tell you that there is a difficulty around change management. People don't like change, and without acknowledging that human effort involved in the change, you're really not going to succeed. Any transformation within a business is not going to be technology focused. It's not going to be process focused. People are going to come first, and if you don't bring those people with you, you're going to end up leaving them behind. So often people working with smaller scale systems think that think it's just a case of widening the scope out, actually doing more of the existing system. But really, again, if we think back to our maturity model, you're moving from a compliance mindset to a risk mindset. That's a big change for people. It's a big change for them to get their heads around, and you need to make a case for it within their own minds to get that traction, to get that change within the business. Otherwise, people will just ignore you and they won't use the systems. Finding key stakeholders, finding some allies within the business, really important. It's really going to drive home that message of change. The other thing to think about here as well is reviewing past transformations within a business. Culturally, some businesses are really agile. They can take changes very easily. Other organizations really struggle with this. And if your organization has struggled with change in the past, you need to make extra effort in this area to really bring people along, really take them through that transformation. Create a communications plan. That's one of the key things I would recommend for this kind of change management. You need to think about finding those small wins, those early wins, the ROI cases that you can really show to people, prove back to people that their change and their change in behavior is rewarding and it's bringing the business forward. If you fail to do that, people will sort of lose interest, and at the first sign of trouble, they'll fall away from your system and you'll lose their support. The final piece of the presentation I want to cover here is the common pitfalls. We've looked around some various techniques here, but there are some pitfalls that are applicable to any stage of transformation, and they're probably not specific to TPRM transformation either. The first one is automating everything, and this feeling and this need to run before you can walk. There are plenty of examples in the world where automation is going to help, and it's going to take any of those mundane, frequent tasks and it's going to remove the effort from them. It's going to make them more consistent and, again, improve efficiency. Where it doesn't save time and money is when it removes the human element from the risk picture. Risk is very much subjective. It's very much reviewed by people. If you take people away from the assessment of risk and you just use automated rules and engines, you're going to take away some of that human element to review and spot trends, to spot differences, to have that suspicious element. There's a reason why our police officers aren't all robots. In an interview, they might have a conversation with someone, go through a checklist, but the moment they suspect there's something not quite right, they'll escalate. Same goes for your TPRM program. The moment you've got a questionnaire that doesn't feel quite right, you'll drill into it as a human. The automated system simply won't. So just keep that in mind in terms of when you're pushing automation. The other one is to automate low return or infrequent activity. That's really not worth it. It's not going to be worth the value of putting that into an automated process. The next of these pitfalls is overconnection. So connecting everything to everything. Any risk and control expert will with a whiteboard and enough time will draw more lines than a game of Kaplunk. Effectively, this is adding more and more complexity to the picture because everything is interrelated. Risk is about all context, and all context feeds into risk. But the important thing is when you're setting up these systems is to think about simplicity. You will never add or you'll never remove complexity to a system and make it more simple in its lifespan. You'll only ever add more complexity. So every time you have a complex decision or something that you need to add, or a relationship between a risk and a control or a regulation, you really need to draw that back in and really ask yourself, do I need to do this change? So the final one here is information obesity. And this is a word I've come across recently, but it perfectly describes what happens with many programs. There is a desire to create a solution that's going to last for 5, 10 years. And so everyone crams as much information as possible into this system. And really, it starts to add such a level of complexity that it's going to become impossible to create an easy to use system. Users will have so many fields to fill in. When you're coming to write reports, you won't know what fields mean, you won't know what information you have available. Not every piece of information will be filled in. So scale back some of that ambition to fit everything into the system on day one and allow it to grow over time. So finally, a little bit on Sue's journey. She's made it, she's established the program, and now she's off at the Christmas party doing karaoke and enjoying herself with the CISO, having implemented a really successful stage 4 transition.